Started. So I first want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. I know that we've got a mix of maybe people who have been vaccinated or haven't been vaccinated. Obviously with COVID, this is something that's always changing. With COVID-19, we're learning and growing as we go. With the vaccines, there's been a lot of new news that's come out. So with people who have already gotten the vaccine, I'm sure there's some questions that people may have. And it's always good to just be educated about the vaccines that you're receiving. And this way, if you have friends who may have questions, you can also share the wealth of knowledge with them. So I want to first give a little intro to Dr. Scales. So Dr. Scales is a hospitalist and medical sociologist at Weill Cornell Medical College. He has extensive experience working with Palestinian and Syrian refugees and community health programs in the Middle East and here in the United States, having developed workshops on caring for Muslim patients. Dr. Scales's research interests center on structural determinants of health disparities, and medical communication, and his current project focusing on building the COVID-19 vaccine confidence in online communities. So obviously with COVID-19, we're in an online world. So there's definitely opportunities for learning about medicine and learning how to do it in in the virtual world, which is not always easy to do. So thank you for your work and thank you for spending the time to talk with us today. And I'm going to pin your video for everyone.
Great. Thank you very much. I've shared for those who have joined by on their computer. I've shared a presentation. I'll go through the presentation, but I don't necessarily think it's necessary to see all of the slides to participate. I hope this is my goal. As we go through this is not for me to essentially provide a lecture and essentially be trying to convince you of something, but my goal is essentially to provide a little bit of information, hopefully filling some, any gaps in information that you might have about the vaccines that are available. And then I'd really love to kind of dive more into discussion, hear from you kind of what some of your thoughts and your concerns are. And then, obviously, if I have answers to those questions, I have a wealth of information at my disposal that I hope to be able to bring to at least help you be as informed as possible about this decision. So with that, so I'm just going to be giving an overview about the COVID vaccines, about what they are, what they do, how they do it, just to give everyone a bit of a background. So I think a lot of people, some of you have been vaccinated, but some people are still asking the question about why they might need to get vaccinated. So there's a lot of different reasons why vaccination would be, from the perspective of a medical person, why it would be a good idea. So to give a couple of those reasons, like vaccinations in general, they generally help us protect ourselves. They also help us protect our family and our communities, because then if we're vaccinated, it's much harder to spread a disease. And obviously, also, the more of us get vaccinated, the less the virus can spread overall, and that's going to help us end this pandemic. It's also, when we think about, the various different levels of protection that a vaccine can offer. So the vaccines have been shown to be very helpful in protecting ourselves from COVID-19. So, as we all know, COVID-19 has been very problematic. Over 1.6 million people have been hospitalized in the United States with it over the past year. And there's been over 560,000 deaths. And the symptoms that people sometimes get if they do get COVID, are things that sound like a typical illness. Things like a runny nose or congestion, fevers or chills, sometimes coughing or shortness of breath, just fatigue and feeling run down. Some people have diarrhea or headaches. A number of people going along with fatigue can have muscle or body aches or a sore throat. And this is somewhat an unusual symptom, is a number of people with COVID have been reporting a loss of taste or smell. So again, kind of getting a vaccine usually can help you avoid a lot of these symptoms because once you've had the vaccine, it's a lot harder to get COVID. One of the reasons we also think it can be helpful to get vaccinated is we're still learning about this disease. We don't necessarily know what the long-term consequences of COVID are. You know, in some of our early data, we only have a year's worth of experience, but it seems to cause a number of longer-term problems that we're still learning about. Heart problems. Sometimes people have kidney problems after they've had COVID. Definitely people that got COVID are at increased risk of blood clots while they have the illness. And even afterwards, even after people recover, people are talking about how they still have some lung problems, some lung issues. Their lungs just don't feel like they've gotten back to normal, or certain types of brain fog. Some people talk about this as either like long-term COVID or long-haul COVID or long-haul symptoms. But this type of extended symptoms with COVID is something we're still trying to wrap our heads around. And I know there's a lot of studies, a lot of research that's being funded to try to understand this better. But this is another reason to protect yourself with a vaccine is because people who get vaccinated are at less risk of having some of these longer term problems from the disease. So we also mentioned just how important it is to get vaccinated to help protect your family and your community because, you know, I imagine most of you are probably eligible for the vaccine, but there's a lot of people that are not, especially so right now the vaccines are only recommended for adults, essentially the age 16 and over. There was a study just published in the New England Journal of Medicine this week that said that the vaccines are safe in pregnant people. And so even though the recommendation was to vaccinate pregnant people, now there's even more data behind it. And I think we're going to start seeing recommendations from lots of specialist societies to vaccinate pregnant women as well. But the more people that get vaccinated, the more it helps ensure that we have community immunity. So not just immunity in yourself, but that there's enough immunity between all the different people in your community so that the virus can't spread there. And that helps protect the people who can't yet get vaccinated for various different reasons. So that's always something to keep in mind is vaccinating isn't just about you, but sometimes vaccinating can also help protect your family and your community. So one question a lot of people ask is, do the vaccines work? Is it worth getting the vaccine, right? Somebody sticking a needle in your arm if it doesn't work. And one of the things I would say is yes, the vaccines are highly effective. So one thing I'll mention, and I have a particular bias here, is so when I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, I happened to work in the laboratory of Drew Weissman and Caitlin Carrico, who were the two researchers who developed the mRNA technology behind the vaccines. So I've been following these vaccines and the technology behind them for over 20 years. So I've been very encouraged to see just how powerful these vaccines are and just how effective they are at preventing COVID. So all of the vaccines we have, including some of the more recent ones that have come out, are highly effective at preventing COVID-19 disease, which is fantastic. Now, I want to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean nothing in this world is 100%. In very rare instances, sometimes someone might still get infected. I've taken care of patients who've gotten the vaccine, but then later did get infected, but their infections were much, much, much less severe than we might have otherwise expected. So overall, one of the things that the vaccine seems to do is protect from infection, and then even for the people who happen to get COVID, the small minority, they seem to have a much milder illness. So when we think more about, is the vaccine safe? We also, I think we're worried about specifically in the communities that we live and we work in. right? So one of the things to remember is that the vaccines were studied in a very diverse sample of tens of thousands of people. And since then, we've been continuing to generate data as people get vaccinated. We, of course, want to learn more to understand if there's any problems from the vaccine or anything else that comes up. And so we're looking at over 120 million people who've now been vaccinated in the United States, which is fantastic. And we're still seeing a very, very strong safety record from the vaccines, which to me is such a triumph of science. It's fantastic to be able to say that. So a lot of people have raised some concerns about how fast the vaccines were made. Some people say like, hey, like how did that happen so quickly? Almost they kind of wonder whether or not someone was planning this, or kind of raise the question of if they can make those vaccines so quickly, why aren't they able to make other drugs or vaccines as quickly? So I just want to walk through a little bit of what that means and how the vaccines were able to be made so quickly, but also without undermining any of the safety policies and procedures that the FDA has in place to make sure that the vaccines are safe. So again, I want to stress that these vaccines, it seems like they happen quickly, but 20 years ago, I was working in a laboratory trying to help develop some of the technology around these vaccines. So these vaccines have really been in development for decades. It's only essentially the last mile that happened quickly over the past year. One of the ways that they did this is when we think about kind of all of the research that goes into a vaccine, there's a number of different steps. And one of the things that happened was timelines were overlapped for a lot of these steps to speed up the process. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail. But so while these timelines were overlapped, no steps were skipped, and all of the same safety standards that we normally look for in all of our vaccines and our expert reviews were all used for these vaccines as well. So just to give a sense, a traditional vaccine timeline has all of the basic research. So that's where I did a little bit of my work 20 years ago. So there's the basic research in the laboratory. And once researchers think that they've got a technology that might work, they take it into clinical trials. And clinical trials normally take a lot of years. And that's because there's a lot of different steps in the clinical trials. So there's a phase one. Phase one just tests safety. A phase two, which starts to test in a larger number of people to see whether or not the technology works and start to figure out which dose of the technology is best. And then finally, there's the phase three. The phase three is the study that uses the largest number of people and tries to understand, does this actually work or not? And then even after all of these trials are done, then the company that's working on this sends all of the data to the regulatory bodies like the FDA to assess, is this safe or not, and is this going to get approval? Only after all of that has happened do the pharmaceutical companies start going into production. So as you can imagine, this can take a long time. If you're a pharmaceutical company, you're spending money on the research, you spend money on a phase one trial, every step along the way, you're not going to spend more money unless you have a very good idea that things are going to work. So part of what takes a long time is everyone needs to kind of gather all the data, see if it's working, and see if it's worth investing the money to go to the next phase, because each phase is even more expensive than the last. So in this case, there was some acceleration of the timeline by overlapping some of these steps. So what happened was the phase one trials, the phase two trials, and the phase three trials were all clumped together. Now that what doesn't mean that they were all done in the same people, but they basically were done in overlapping ways. They didn't wait for the phase one trial to be done before they started phase two. And same, they didn't wait for phase 1 or phase 2 to be done before they started phase 3. They also did production as early as possible. They basically took a gamble and said, we think these vaccines are going to work, so let's start making them now. The way they were able to do this is, as I mentioned before, how pharmaceutical companies aren't going to go from step 1 to step 2 and step 2 to step 3 unless they know it's going to work, because it's going to cost them a lot of money. So the way that we were able to essentially accelerate this timeline was the federal government basically started funding a lot of these projects and said, don't worry about the risk, just start doing it like this and we'll help make sure that the funding is there. Once funding is not an issue, we can make things happen very quickly. So that's how all of the clinical trials and all of the production could happen so quickly. But also, so don't forget, we're in a global pandemic, right? So normally the regulatory bodies take a long time to review a lot of this information. I mean, can take months to years usually. So some people are asking the question, how could that happen so fast? So the way that happened so fast was the expert reviewers at these regulatory bodies. You can imagine with a global pandemic, they stopped whatever they were doing. When that file came in to review these vaccines, they reviewed it immediately. And they looked at this as quickly as possible. And that accelerated the timeline for the review. And so the reviews happened much more quickly than usual. So because of that, we took a process that normally takes years and we were able to streamline it into just a matter of months. So I think this is, again, this is a bit of a triumph of science. And this is something that to me that shows if we have the funds and essentially the political will at some of these regulatory bodies, we can make some of these things happen very quickly while maintaining the standards for safety and security to make sure that we're not sacrificing quality. So a number of people have asked the question of whether or not these vaccines are safe in specific populations. I think there's been a disproportionate toll from COVID in particular communities, especially in New York. Latino communities and Black communities have much higher infection rates and much higher death rates than other parts of New York. So I think it's important to recognize that the vaccines themselves, there were quite a number of different points along the way that included a very wide range of people from diverse backgrounds. So there was a diverse scientific community that came together to make these vaccines. So for example, there's Kizzmekia Corbett, she's an African-American woman from North Carolina, and she was one of the lead researchers at the NIH who was working on these vaccines. The vaccine trials were also inclusive of a diverse population. So one of the trials included sites internationally, and between the trials that were done for both the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, about 10,000 people were from various different diverse backgrounds, either coming from Black communities in the United States or abroad, or Latino communities in the United States or abroad. So one of the things that we say is actually the communities that have been most hurt by COVID are actually probably the most likely to benefit from the vaccine, because the vaccines themselves can help stop that suffering and help all of us, including those communities, get back to normal as soon as possible. There's also a lot of questions about the new variants. And I will say, we're still learning about these new variants. This is a new virus. It's only been around for about 1.5 years. We're still learning about it. So as the virus changes, which is a natural thing that viruses do over time, we're still learning more about it. The good news is that the vaccinations are still our best tool to stop these new variants. So, we're still learning exactly how much the vaccines protect against these new variants, but the data so far suggests that they do a much better job than we would expect, and definitely a much better job than either getting infected or not getting vaccinated.
Sure that they died.
So for those of you who have their computer and are looking at this presentation, I just want to highlight that there's a couple of places. If you're interested in making a vaccine appointment, there's a lot of resources. So there's the New York State Vaccination Hotline. And this is a number that you can call. It's 833 NYS 4 VAX, so 4 VAX. There's also, if you're a Spanish speaker, it's 833 Somos New York, so Somos NY. And a number of other kind of like vaccine sites that are around the area that can basically have the capacity. If you're interested in having a vaccine appointment, it's very possible to get one now. And if you're having trouble making an appointment, then I definitely recommend reaching out to your healthcare provider, friends and family, because there's a lot of resources out there that can help make sure that you get a vaccine appointment. And again, once you have the appointment, then it's just a question of figuring out the logistics of how to get there and how to get home and who's going to go with you.
I just wanted to add, I highly suggest the 877 Vax line. They've had a lot of availabilities recently. Also, there's certain locations that are walk-in sites if you're 50 plus. Also, we can give you the number for Curb, who provides free transportation if you're a senior to and from your vaccine appointment. If you're not a senior or someone you know is interested in getting the vaccine and is not a senior, I believe Uber and Via have 40% off your ride to and from your vaccine appointment. And you can always reach out to me if you have any friends or family members who are interested in getting the vaccine, and we can send along this information to you.
Thank you, Gemma. That's very helpful. Again, so I think the point of that is, don't let making an appointment be a barrier. Don't let the logistics of how to get there and back be a barrier. Reach out. There are resources. So in the meantime, right, because I know some of you have been vaccinated, it's important to recognize that it's going to take some time for everyone to be vaccinated, right? Because it takes 2 doses. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. So in the meantime, we still need to keep doing what we know works. Wearing a mask, washing your hands, and watching your distance, trying to stay about 6 feet apart. I've heard some good recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control that's basically, you need to make sure you're doing 2 out of 3. And those 3 things being keeping at least 6 feet apart, wearing a mask, or being outside. So as long as you're doing 2 out of those 3, you're doing a lot of good work to help protect yourself from the virus. So I say all of this. This is just a very basic primer on the vaccine, and I know people have questions. So again, my job is to provide some information, and then I hope we can have a little bit more of a discussion. And as you guys have questions, I want to see if I can help provide you any more information that helps you make the decision that's right for you about the vaccine, or point you in the right direction to either other experts or other physicians. So with that, up on screen right now are a couple different questions that sometimes people might have. I don't want to plant questions in your head. I'm going to leave these here for a second. And if people have questions about these things, I'm happy to talk about them. But I'm more interested in the questions that you might have that are coming up as you talk about the vaccine with your friends and your families.
I wanted to throw 2 out there that people have shared with me that aren't necessarily on this call right now. The first one is if you could just briefly explain your interpretation of the recent data that's come out about Pfizer and Moderna being approved for the 6-month efficacy. I know that there's been some confusion where people have heard about that study and they're concerned that their vaccine only is effective for 6 months. And then also the other question is, of course, the elephant in the vaccine room of the Johnson & Johnson vaccines.
Yes, thanks for raising that. So I'm going to ask you to take off your shoes for a second and put on the shoes of a scientist. So one of the things that a scientist thinks about is scientist is very careful about what they say. So they're not going to say something unless they know it to be true. So when we think about some of the things that scientists say, it sometimes sounds a little obvious because it's obvious to the rest of us because we might have believed it for a long time. But from a scientist's perspective, they might only now feel comfortable saying that this is true because they have really, really solid data to say that something is true. So there's been some discussion about essentially how long the vaccines last. And so there's a lot of studies right now that are trying to understand how long the vaccines last, as well as if you've gotten COVID, how long might you be protected from getting COVID again? So again, COVID's been around for a year and a half, so we're still learning a lot about this. But one of the things that's important is we as scientists tend not to make pronouncements about these things until we've got pretty strong data. So the announcement that came out recently was essentially saying we now have enough data to say for sure that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines provide at least 6 months efficacy. So that's great news, right? But don't forget that the scientists are not saying that they last longer yet because we don't yet have enough data to say that for sure. Now, do we think that that might actually be the case? Yes. So we're very interested in trying to understand this more and understand in which people is the vaccine going to last longer and in which people might the vaccine be a little bit shorter, and then make sure that we can vaccinate the people that are more susceptible earlier and do that if we need to more frequently. So what I would say is in the vast majority of people, we know that the vaccines are going to last at least 6 months. I think we're going to learn later that they probably last longer as more data comes out. But don't be surprised if your doctor tells you that, is very kind of conservative about how long we know that the vaccines last until we get more data. Because I think if somebody tries to tell you that the vaccines are going to last 5 years, they'd be lying to you, right? Because we don't have 5 years worth of experience to say how long the vaccines have been lasting, right? So that's one of the things that I think it's just important for you to take off your shoes and put yourself in the shoes of a scientist and how they're being very careful about how they say these things. And I mention this because there's going to be news later that comes out that all of a sudden says the vaccines are good for 9 months maybe, or a year. So don't be surprised when you see those headlines, all right? As for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a bit of a different type of vaccine than the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. So the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines have essentially, we like to call it a mugshot. So they don't contain the virus at all. They contain essentially kind of a blueprint almost like a photograph of the virus that our bodies then look at and are like, oh, this is what the virus looks like. And so if they do see the virus, they kind of know. It's like seeing a mugshot and then later on seeing the person who the mugshot's for and being like, okay, that's what we want. We need to go after that. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a little different. And so it's actually made of using a different type of viral particle. And they put some segments of the coronavirus inside that viral particle. So again, in both cases, in neither situation, is there enough information for your body to actually kind of get infected by the virus, okay? It contains information, but not the virus itself. It's just essentially different delivery packages and how the virus is given to your body. But because of that, because the two types of vaccines are different, we're seeing some different side effects in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And I want to be very clear, the side effects are extremely rare. So we're talking about 1 in a million. So we're talking, to give an example, I don't know if you or a friend of yours or a relative has gotten a blood transfusion. So 1 in a million chance is about the same chance as someone getting a blood transfusion and getting HIV from that transfusion. That's something that happened in the early 80s. That doesn't happen anymore. It's extremely rare. So I want to put this into a frame of mind. I think, I don't know if you or any friend or relative has been in the hospital. I give blood transfusions almost every day when I'm in the hospital. I have never seen a patient get HIV from a blood transfusion. So I would not be surprised if I never actually see a patient that has gotten one of these clots from the Johnson and Johnson vaccine. So one of the things that we say is that these clots is absolutely something that we should be concerned about, and we should look into, and we should understand better. But the data that we have so far shows that by far the risk is very low, and especially low for the older you are. The risk seems to be essentially kind of the concern seems to be highest for younger people. And so the younger you are, the more you might consider whether or not you want to take the J&J vaccine versus if you're on the older side, I would have essentially no concerns about it at all. Because when we're weighing the risk of the Johnson and Johnson vaccine versus COVID, all of the side effects of COVID that I mentioned, some of the heart problems, the kidney problems, the lung problems, those happen extremely frequently with COVID, whereas the side effects we're talking about with the Johnson and Johnson vaccine are extremely rare. So I don't, I'm not someone that's going to try to say things in black and white that like the vaccines are safe. Anything you put in your body, a hamburger even, right, has side effects. And it's important that we understand the risks and the benefits. And the thing that I say is when I look at the risk benefits for these vaccines, including the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, the benefits of these vaccines far outweigh the risks, especially when we start comparing them to the risks of COVID. So I just want to make sure that that's how I view it. And I know the European Medicines Agency just came out and said the same thing. I know the CDC is currently reviewing it right now, and my expectation is they'll probably say something very similar.
We're of course going to open it up to questions. There are a couple people on the phone that I had to mute manually. If you want to ask a question, you can press *6 to unmute yourself. We want to welcome on any questions.
So someone did post a message. I think they sent it directly to me in the chat, so I'll read it out. Someone asked the question, why are some people who are fully vaccinated getting infected with COVID-19? And what does that mean? So the thing that I would say is, so the vaccines do a fantastic job at reducing your risk of infection, but they don't reduce that risk to zero. It is still possible to get COVID if you've been vaccinated. It's very rare, but it can happen. What we do seem to see, though, is even if you've been vaccinated and then you do get COVID, it reduces your risk of getting a very bad COVID infection. So your chances of dying if you get COVID after you've been vaccinated are extremely, extremely low. For example, in the clinical trials, it actually had 100% protection against death. So I think those are that's pretty good data. We don't find vaccines usually that are as effective as that. And so this is why scientists are jumping up and down and very happy, because it's such an effective tool. But still, as I said, scientists were very conservative about how we talk about these things. Very effective does not mean 100% effective. So you will hear about what we call breakthrough cases, and those breakthrough cases do happen. But I'm very pleased that even if there is a breakthrough case, normally that person is better off having been vaccinated than if they were not vaccinated.
Just to add on, this is why they keep saying in all those PSAs to continue to wear your masks, because at the end of the day, you don't want to risk getting the infection, because it's very likely that for some odd reason that you manage to get COVID, your symptoms will be way less intense than it would be if you weren't vaccinated. Also, if you are around people who haven't been vaccinated, you can also potentially transfer the virus to someone else. So it's just a matter of keeping everyone safe.
So there's another question in the chat. And so I'll answer this one, but please do, if people have questions, please feel free to jump in. Happy to answer any questions that people have.
Just a reminder, *6 on the phone if you want to jump in.
There you go. As I'm very interested in hearing what your concerns are, and what some of the challenges are to getting vaccinated. But so this question is asking essentially, if you're fully vaccinated, can you still spread severe COVID to someone who's not vaccinated? So again, what I would say is the vaccines have been shown so far to be extremely effective at reducing transmission. So if you've been vaccinated, it is very rare, but someone who's been vaccinated can get the virus. And someone who's been vaccinated in rare circumstances can transmit the virus. It is possible. But again, we're talking about a rare event for the people who've already had a rare event. All right. So this is one of the reasons why, as Gemma is saying, even if you've been vaccinated, this is why the CDC is starting to recommend the 2 out of 3. Masking, being outside, or distancing at least 6 feet, and continuing to do 2 out of those 3, even if you've been vaccinated. And the thought is, we will be able to stop doing all of that once we all have been vaccinated. That's the idea. But so what I would say is the risk is very low. So some people have asked, hey, if I get vaccinated, can I see my grandkids? And that's a question that's come up a lot. And for a lot of my patients, that's actually been one of the major reasons why they've gotten vaccinated. And the short answer is right now, most scientists and doctors that I know actually say that that's okay. You know, it's still important to take some precautions, right? If you're going to be traveling, absolutely mask up, wash your hands. But, you know, it's going to be nice to see your grandkids again.
Any questions from the people who called in?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
If you've been vaccinated, but then if you say you're an immune compromised person who's been vaccinated, and then the antibody test shows that you failed to produce the spike protein antibody test shows you failed to produce antibodies. Can you say anything about getting monoclonal antibodies, or in other words, what should your next step be?
So that's a great question. So without getting too into the weeds here, one of the things to recognize is that when you get a vaccine, the vaccine, it's helping you create immunity, all right? And we often think of immunity as antibodies, but our immunity is often beyond just antibodies. We've got a whole system in our body that fights infections. And so the vaccine helps us build immunity using that whole system. So it builds antibodies, and it also builds other types of reactions against the virus. Whereas it's worth remembering that the antibody test that you might get at your doctor's office, that's a test that's looking for a certain specific antibody. And that's an antibody that we've found tends to be positive in people who've had people who've had the illness. But that is not necessarily the same antibodies that we find in people who've gotten vaccinated. So what's important to remember is, just how, if you wanted to drive up to Syracuse, there's a lot of different roads you could take, right? So if you want to get to immunity, there's a lot of different antibodies that can help you get to immunity, all right? They don't all have to be the spike protein antibody that the test detects, all right? There's lots of ways to get to Syracuse, lots of ways to get to Niagara Falls, all right? So what I would say, if you're finding yourself in this kind of conundrum, right, where you've gotten the vaccine, but you want to make sure that you're immune because you're immunocompromised, best thing I could say is talk to your doctor, all right? Because it very much depends on what type of immunocompromised person you are, why you're immunocompromised, and then based on that, what your doctor recommends. Because right now I'd say it's a little bit uncharted territory on whether or not, there's something else that you should do, whether or not you should get monoclonal antibodies. And whenever you're in uncharted territory, what I mean by that is whenever you're in territory that essentially relies on expert guidance, the best thing to do is to make sure you're talking to your doctor and your doctor's talking to the experts.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Okay. I am fully vaccinated.
Congratulations.
No, I couldn't wait to have it. I got the vaccine March 12th, so I'm more than about a month, into fully vaccinated. But a question, is it safe? I really don't want to go into indoor restaurants for a while, but do you think it is safe to dine in an indoor restaurant? I don't know if they have a trace, what is it called? Trace and where a person goes in and they take their name and telephone number. So if somebody does have the COVID, they notify you. They were doing that a while ago. I don't know if they're still doing it. Trace and test or something like that. I don't know if they have them anymore. I don't know if they have it anymore in the restaurants, but do you think it is safe to eat in an indoor restaurant right now, or I should wait a while? What do you think?
I think this is a tough question, and I just faced it actually recently with my wife because we went out for a celebratory dinner. The big challenge is, so here's the thing that I would say that has me concerned.
Did you eat indoors? Did you eat indoors in a restaurant?
It's a good question. I'll get there. So we talked about this. And the big thing we were worried about is, so there are some studies that look at transmission of COVID in restaurants. And so it had to do with two factors. One, how closely everyone was sitting. But it wasn't necessarily just how close people were sitting. It had a lot to do with the ventilation systems in the restaurants. Right. And so my concern was, even if I'm sitting 6 feet apart from some other people in the restaurant, you don't really know what the ventilation system is. And so we actually decided to sit outside at the restaurant we went to. Because
that was a good choice.
Because without knowing what the ventilation system is like, now I want to say, like, this, we went to a very small restaurant that, was in an old row house. So it probably has an old ventilation system. We don't even know, right? If you're going to a new restaurant that's got like a state-of-the-art ventilation system, you might be willing to trust it. But those are the things that I'm thinking in the back of my head of how close is everyone sitting together and what is the ventilation system like?
That's what I think of, the ventilation. Aside from sitting 6 feet away from people, it's the ventilation that I'm thinking of, breathing in everybody's air. In other words, when they take off the mask to eat, even if I'm sitting 6 feet away, I don't want to breathe everybody's air when they take off the mask. And who knows, they may not put it back on. No one's policing them to stand over them to say you got to put it right back on because you finished eating. You know what I'm saying? And even if I do sit 6 feet away, I think I'm going to feel uncomfortable because of the ventilation. You know what I'm saying? That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing. I mean, I don't like to be overly cautious, but in this situation, it's a matter of your health.
I think the beauty of this, the fantastic part about this is I think spring and summer is going to help make that question. I think we're all just going to enjoy eating outside.
The whole thing why I'm asking, doctor, is this. It's funny because I'm going to meet my niece. She's coming in from Massachusetts this Sunday to drop off a daughter or whatever. And my sister and I haven't seen them in over a year. So we were thinking, oh, good, we'll eat in a restaurant outdoors. But I heard the weather's not going to be so great on Sunday. So let me ask you a question. If we ate outside, there's a diner we were thinking of going to, and they have the shielding, like the plastic all around. It's a big area. It's a very big area. It's in Queens. And they have heaters and everything. So if the weather's not, they say 100% chance of rain. That's what I'm thinking of. And we're not eating indoors. And we were going to go to a park and bring food, but if it's going to rain, we can't do that. So if we ate in a diner, which is outdoor dining, they have a big outdoor area. They have heaters. They have the plastic. It's all enclosed like with plastic, like a tent, with plastic and everything. So, and if we sit 6 feet apart from people, you think it would be okay?
So very good questions. So the way that I think through this is, again, I'm thinking about, are you able to do the 2 out of 3 that we talked about? And those 2 out of 3, right? Are you able to be 6 feet apart from other people? And it sounds like that's the case. Are you able to wear a mask? If you're eating, you're not going to be able to wear a mask, right? So that one's not a kind of, and so the other one is you have to essentially be either completely separated from everyone else or outside, right? So sometimes you see
it
some
is
restaurants.
Outside. It's outdoors. It is outdoors, but it's enclosed with plastic, though.
So
the
that's
sides
so
and everything.
then the question you have to ask yourself is how many other people are enclosed in that plastic? Because I've seen some restaurants that have outdoor spaces, that outdoor space is essentially has become an indoor space because there's no ventilation in that outdoor space.
But they will have, you know what, we've eaten in there before in September or October, of last year. And we ate there, and they have, the front is all open, like the front area. You know what I mean? And they have another area that's a little open also, even though it's enclosed with plastic. We'll go in the afternoon, maybe 1 or 2 in the afternoon when it won't be as crowded. You know what I mean? And what I'm thinking of is we're going with my niece, who's in her 50s, and her husband in his 50s, and they got the vaccine about 2 weeks ago, both of them. One got the Pfizer, one got the Johnson & Johnson about 2 weeks ago. So if we're sitting at a table with them, I wonder if it's going to be okay. They're cautious about everything too. When they came to visit us last year, I'll just tell you quickly, in September, they got tested first before they even visited us. But we visited them outdoors in a park. We went to see them.
I don't want to cut you off because I think you have a.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But
so
I think ultimately,
okay with them?
Yeah, ultimately it comes down to what your comfort level is, because at the end of the day,
right,
if you're able to sit outside and it's completely outside, that's always great. But obviously certain restaurants have certain structures that they've built that may not allow for ventilation. You may get there and find that the outdoor dining is super crowded, but the indoor dining is completely empty. So it really just comes down to what your comfort is. In the city, they're still doing the contact tracing, where someone has to sign their name and get their temperature taken. They're supposed to be contact tracing, where they take the name of someone in the party and they take the temperature and then the time and your phone number. Obviously, each restaurant is doing that as effectively as they can. Hopefully, crossing our fingers. But when it comes down to it, eating really comes down to your personal comfort, because there is still
doing contract tracing for indoor dining, correct?
Yeah,
They're still doing
but
that?
not outdoor dining. If you sit outside,
no, not
you're
outdoor.
required to collect it. So,
all right.
I didn't want to cut you off.
I don't want to hold you up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Did anyone else have any questions? Again, if you're on the phone, *6. And if you're on the computer, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Hello.
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 Yeah, you can hear me. Thank you. I just want to ask a question because I travel by public transportation. And sometimes in the bus, they turn on the heater even though it's not that cold, and then and you start to feel uncomfortable. And if you, I didn't, but if you cough, people will look at you as if you got the virus. So how do you prevent that? Should I still take a public transportation or no more? Thank you so much. Do you understand my question? I'm sorry.
I do, yes. So
Yes.
one thing I would say is, so if you're doing the right things, and what I mean by that is if you're staying 6 feet away from people, if you're wearing a mask, if you're washing your hands, I think it's possible you might get some looks, but as long as you're wearing a mask, for example, I wear a mask sometimes 12 hours a day when I'm in the hospital. It's guaranteed that I'm going to cough at some point, right? But I'm coughing
Yes,
in
that's
my
right.
mask. I'm coughing in my mask.
Yes.
I sneeze in my mask. I mean, that's a little gross, but I don't want to share that with you. But so, one of the things to often say is just reinforce, like, trying to stay away from the heater if you can, if you have that option.
Yes, yes,
As well
okay.
as I have had some people, they cough or they sneeze, and the first thing they say after they do that is, I'm vaccinated.
Yes, yeah. I even have a card showing that I'm vaccinated. But people look at you, especially now because of this profile. They look at you as if you are not 100% American, as I said.
Yes.
But you're an American citizen. But the thing is, the looks, the color. They look
Exactly.
at what the color.
There's a lot of assumptions
and then
there.
Look at you. Yeah, they look at you, and then if they think that they can bully you, they might hit you or they push you, all that. Yeah,
I know what
hope
you mean.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm blessed. Nobody do that to me, and I
Yeah.
hope and pray that nobody do that. Okay, or to anybody. Thank you.
I
so
agree.
Much. Okay, that's about all the question. Thank you so much. Right.
Of
I don't want
course.
to waste more time.
No,
All right. Thank
it's
you.
okay. The one thing I would add to that is just that I have definitely changed my routine so that when I take public transportation, I'm doing it at hours to make sure that it's less crowded. I get up earlier to make sure that I can take public transportation. So if I'm on it, I can be farther away from people. And then obviously I have enough time when I get to work that I can wash my hands and do all the things that I want to do before I jump into work. So that's the other thing that I think about is if you can adjust the timing that you go to make sure that you're able to distance as much as possible while you're on public transportation, then that should help out too.
All right. Thank you so much, After.
Happy to help.
Yeah. Stay healthy and safe. Okay. Bye-bye.
You as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions? We still have a few minutes left.
Gemma, Doctor, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Not for me, but a good friend of mine, she had fully vaccinated, and 3 weeks after her vaccination, she says that her arm is completely numb and she can hardly use her arm. Is it possible that happen from the vaccine?
That's a great question.
She says she can't hardly lift her arm and even to close her bra. And I was saying it sounds unusual, but that's what she was saying to me. She's 74 years old, lady.
Excellent question. So one of the things that's come up with the vaccine is, to give you a short answer, essentially, we don't yet know whether or not something like that is associated with the vaccine. Because the challenge with this, again, take off your shoes, put on the shoes of a scientist, right? It's because different things are happening to different people all the time, right? Even if there was no vaccine, people would have heart attacks, they'd have strokes, they would have weird problems in their arms. That stuff would happen if there's a vaccine or not a vaccine. So the way we have to figure out whether or not it's related to the vaccine is by essentially doing some scientific processes using some statistic to find out if the people who've gotten vaccinated have higher rates of those things than people who haven't gotten vaccinated. That takes some time. So the short answer is it might be related, but if it is, it seems to be extremely rare because it's not something that we've been hearing come up with the vaccine so far. One of the things I would say is if something like that does happen, your friend, she should talk to her doctor because the doctor can help decide whether or not this is something that should be reported to the Centers for Disease Control, and they look into these kinds of things to help figure out if this is the kind of thing that is happening on a wider basis.
But she said she was going to do that. She was going to call her doctor, and I told her to do it. And she says, I said, so other people can hear it, and then he will be able to tell her if maybe other people call in or something unusual.
Wonderful.
Okay,
Wonderful.
thank you.
There's also something, your doctor can report, you can also report. The FDA has a program called MedWatch, and I'll put it in the chat. And that MedWatch program is something where people like you, if you feel like you've experienced a side effect from a vaccine or a drug, you yourself can report that to the FDA, and the scientists there will look into it.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So there was one other question in the chat saying,
No,
how
there's
co- Oh,
there's
go ahead,
another question.
please.
My niece, she's 45 years old, but she's very allergic to all kind of different medicines, and she's very scared to take the vaccine. If she take it, would it affect her?
So that is a good question. So the rates of people who've been having some allergic reactions to vaccines is very low. It's on the order of 1 out of every 100 or 200,000 people. So there are some people that seem to be more prone to just allergic reactions in general. And there are some people who have had allergic reactions to the vaccine. What's interesting is right now, there does not seem to be any link between those two things. Excuse me. So right now, what we've seen is people who've had allergic reactions to the vaccines just seems to happen randomly. And there's no predicting who seems to have those very rare reactions. So one of the things that we often say is number one, if someone has a lot of allergic reactions, talk to their doctor. Their doctor is going to know them best and help weigh those risks and benefits. In general, though, what I have seen is most of the time, the vast majority of cases, the risk benefit tends to push towards vaccination, but just with a lot of precautions. So sometimes people that have had reactions to vaccines or allergies in the past, for those of you who've been vaccinated, you probably had to wait 15 minutes for them to watch you. Some people with a history of having some difficulty in the past, they ask for you to wait a half an hour before you go on. So it's one of those things where this is the kind of thing that, where you get the vaccine, just, have your niece be open about that. Talk to her doctor. And if her doctor says, go ahead and get vaccinated, just make sure the people at the vaccine center kind of know about that so they can watch for it. But there's a lot of people, about 1% of people who live in the United States have allergy-like problems. So when you think about that, 134 million people have been vaccinated. That's 1.3 million people who have some allergy problems. And we still haven't seen kind of any real dramatic problems from those people with allergy problems getting vaccinated.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
Okay. If I am fully vaccinated and I'm driving a car, and can I have another passenger with me who's fully vaccinated in the car, who doesn't live in my household, if they sit in the back seat?
So right now, the current recommendations are that that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, and we leave the windows open?
That's even better. Again, the more precautions you take, the lower the risk of anything being transmitted is. And as the weather warms up, definitely roll down the windows.
So if I'm in the car with my husband, he's fully vaccinated, I'm fully vaccinated, and we have a passenger in the back seat, even though we're not 6 feet apart from her, even if it's a short ride, it's okay, as long as we roll down the windows.
Especially, I think, Gemma put it best, where it's essentially the more precautions you take, the more you lower your risk. And so if you are in an enclosed space, wearing a mask helps lower your risk. Opening the windows lowers your risk.
Yeah, we'll all wear masks, the three of us. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
that's kind of the way I would think
passenger
about
who
it.
doesn't live in our household, she is fully vaccinated. So she'll
Wonderful.
wear a mask. We roll down the windows. I'm sure. I hope it's going to be okay.
I can really quickly just read through the CDC guidelines of what you can do if you've fully been vaccinated. I'm going to go through it really quick because I know we still have the question about booster shots and the question, what's going on with that. So if you've been fully vaccinated, the CDC says you can visit inside a home or private setting without a mask or with other fully vaccinated people. So to answer that question, the CDC says if you've all been vaccinated in your car, if you're comfortable, you can sit in the car with them without a mask. Again, this is all based on your own comfort level, but the CDC says that that's okay. You can visit in a private home without a mask with the household of with one household of unvaccinated people who are not at risk for severe illness. So this is saying you've been vaccinated, you're safe, you may be engaging in a little bit risky behavior, but if you are engaging with people who don't have high risk for illness, you should be in safe waters. Obviously, it's helpful to get tested too, for them to get tested before you visit them. But again, all based on comfort level. You can travel domestically without pre or post-travel test. Again, comfort level. Travel domestically without quarantining after travel. Again, comfort level. Travel internationally without a pre-travel test, depending on destination. So certain countries are allowing for people to travel to another country if they've been fully vaccinated without having to be tested. And then travel internationally without quarantining after travel. So these are what the CDC recommends. What they don't recommend is visiting indoors with someone who is at increased risk for COVID and attend medium or large gatherings. So they put out these guidelines, but again, it's always better to be safe than sorry. Highly recommend wearing masks, being in a well-ventilated area. If you're outside, that's even better. So, it's really just erring on the side of caution.
Right. Thank you.
We only have time for one more question, and we were going to jump to the booster, but we can, if you want to email it to me, I can forward it to Dr. Scales if that's okay.
Happy to. So someone asked a question in the chat about whether or not are we close to getting a booster shot in the near future. What I would say is I think this is an open question because this depends on two factors. So one is as the scientists start learning how long our immune protection against the virus lasts. If we find that it doesn't last very long, we might need some booster shots, as well as what happens with some of these variants that are going around. Because they're a little bit different than the original strain of the virus that the vaccine was produced against. So I wouldn't be surprised if sometime, in the next year or two, that there are an extra vaccine shot available that functions both as a booster against the original virus, but also starts to contain more information so we can fight against these variants. Similar to like if you ever get the flu vaccine is actually, it's a vaccine against multiple different types of flu. I think we might end up start doing the same thing for coronavirus.
Great. So I think that about wraps it up. We're a little over time. Thank you so much, Dr. Scales, for spending the time and answering some questions, maybe dispelling some myths, and just being open to any questions we have. Feel free to give me a call or email me if you had a question that was not able to be answered, and I can pass it along and then kind of be the middleman for that question. I recorded this meeting, so I'm going to share it after if you have friends or family that want to, you feel like the questions that were asked may help answer some questions that they have. And I'll also be sharing the information for the walk-up sites for 50 people who are 50 plus in the 5 boroughs, as well as the information for how to book a free transportation transportation to and from vaccine sites for seniors, as well as the CDC guidelines for what you're allowed to do post-vaccine. So thank you everyone for your time. I know it's a little bit late, but I really appreciate you guys joining us and for your great questions. And thank you again to Dr. Scales, and also Andrea, thank you so much for coordinating this.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
It
you.
was great to chat with you all.